And hello everyone, welcome to Audio Sleep Channel. My name is Arthur, and I've had the distinct pleasure of knowing dear Miss Jane Marple for many, many years. Indeed, I've heard countless tales from her, recounted over cups of Earl Grey by the fire in St. Mary Mead. She has a way of seeing things, a way of connecting seemingly disparate threads with an uncanny accuracy that would astound even the most seasoned police inspector. Tonight, I would like to tell the story of one such adventure, a most curious case that unfolded during the crisp, frosted days leading up to Christmas in a quiet corner of the English countryside. It involves a grand old house, a family steeped in secrets, and a festive symbol that, quite unexpectedly, became entangled in a most unfortunate demise. So, dim the lights, settle into your most comfortable chair, and let us journey back to a time when secrets lingered in the air like wood smoke, and a sharp mind could untangle the most intricate of human puzzles. Now let's begin with Chapter 1 of The Death of the Christmas Tree. Chapter 1, The First Frost and a Fateful Call. The first true frost had arrived in St. Mary Mead, painting the cottage windows with delicate fern patterns and hardening the puddles in the lane to brittle sheets of ice. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a sensible wool shawl, sat by her drawing-room fire, mending a pair of worn gardening gloves. The scent of wood smoke mingled pleasantly with the faint aroma of lavender potpourri. Her mind, however, was not entirely on the careful stitches. It drifted, as it often did, to the subtle complexities of human nature, which she found far more engaging than any fictional drama. A sudden insistent ring from the telephone in the hall startled her. Telephones were still a novelty for many, a sometimes unwelcome intrusion into the quiet rhythm of village life. Miss Marple, after a moment's consideration, rose with a sigh, her joints protesting softly. It was unlikely to be a casual chat. Her calls were few and usually carried a degree of urgency. "Marple residence," she announced into the receiver, her voice clear despite its gentle age. A rather flustered voice, tinged with a faint tremble, responded. "Miss Marple, is that truly you? It's Eleanor Finch from Little Netherbury. I do hope I'm not disturbing you." Miss Marple paused. Eleanor Finch. She cast her mind back, recalling a distant cousin of her late aunt, a woman she'd met perhaps once, years ago, at a rather tedious garden party. Eleanor had seemed a delicate, rather anxious creature then, prone to fluttering gestures and nervous laughter. "Eleanor, my dear," Miss Marple replied, a touch of warmth entering her tone. "Not at all. How delightful to hear from you, though I must admit I am surprised." "Oh, Miss Marple, forgive my presumption, but I'm in a dreadful state. Christmas is nearly upon us, and Alistair insists on a grand celebration this year, despite everything. We're hosting a small family gathering, and I simply felt a sudden urge to reach out to you." Eleanor's voice faltered, trailing off into a breathy silence. Miss Marple waited patiently. She had learned long ago that people, when left to their own devices, often revealed more through their pauses than their pronouncements. "Alistair," Eleanor continued, regaining a fragile composure, "is my husband, you see. He's always been rather particular, but lately he's become difficult, suspicious. He's made some changes, you understand, to his affairs, and it's caused no end of unpleasantness with our nephew, Geoffrey. And, well, there's just an atmosphere. A feeling? I can't quite describe it, but it's rather like the air before a thunderstorm, don't you think?" Miss Marple hummed softly. "Indeed, Eleanor. A feeling can often be a most accurate barometer. Are you suggesting you would like me to—" "What exactly, my dear?" "Oh!" Eleanor exclaimed, as if startled by the directness. "I know it's terribly forward, but Alistair mentioned you were a keen gardener, and we have rather extensive grounds. I thought perhaps you might enjoy a change of scenery for Christmas. Just a few days. It would be a great comfort to me, Miss Marple. A fresh perspective, a calm presence. I find myself quite unmoored." Miss Marple considered this. Eleanor Finch's invitation was transparently a plea for help, thinly veiled by the promise of gardening and a festive atmosphere. A calm presence was often requested by those whose own nerves were frayed to breaking point, and the mention of an atmosphere, suspicious behavior, and unpleasantness with a nephew all combined with the vague sense of foreboding, pricked Miss Marple's interest. She knew that trouble often arrived wrapped in the most innocent of guises. "Little Netherbury, you say?" Miss Marple mused aloud. "I believe I recall it. A charming village, if memory serves." "Oh, it is, it is. And Finch Manor is quite lovely, though perhaps a trifle large for just Alistair and me now. Please, Miss Marple, say you'll consider it, even for a day or two before Christmas itself. It would truly mean the world." The urgency in Eleanor's voice was unmistakable. Miss Marple, ever sensitive to genuine distress, felt a familiar stirring of duty. Her mending could wait. The quiet life of St. Mary Mead, while cherished, sometimes presented opportunities for applying her unique brand of observation to a more complex canvas. Besides, a new village, new faces, new problems. It was, in its own way, an invitation to a puzzle. "Well, Eleanor," Miss Marple finally said, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips, "I believe a change of air might be rather agreeable. Thank you for thinking of me. I shall arrange my travel. Perhaps I could arrive on the 22nd? There was a gasp of relief from the other end. "Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Miss Marple, thank you. I shall have Martha prepare the blue room." "You truly are a godsend." Miss Marple replaced the receiver, a faint frown creasing her brow. A godsend indeed. She had a feeling that little Netherbury might have more in store for her than just a quiet Christmas holiday. The atmosphere Eleanor spoke of felt rather too tangible, too real. And Christmas, Miss Marple knew from long experience, often had a way of bringing not just joy, but also latent resentments and buried secrets to the surface. She had a sudden, inexplicable premonition that this particular Christmas might prove to be anything but peaceful. The following morning, Miss Marple packed her sensible valise, including her mending kit and a volume of botanical illustrations. She wondered what peculiar variety of unpleasantness she would discover lurking beneath the festive cheer of Finch Manor. Chapter 2. Arrival at Finch Manor. 2 days later, the small bustling railway station at Netherbury Halt deposited Miss Marple onto a frost-nipped platform. The air was bracing, carrying the crisp scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. A car, a rather grand, if slightly dusty, pre-war Daimler, was waiting, and a stout, impeccably uniformed chauffeur tipped his cap respectfully. "Miss Marple, I presume?" "I'm Jenkins. Mrs. Finch sent me to fetch you." His voice was gruff but not unkind. "Indeed, Jenkins." "A pleasure," Miss Marple replied, settling into the plush rear seat. She noted the small details, the meticulously polished brass fittings, the faint scent of leather and petrol, the way Jenkins handled the wheel with quiet competence. Finch Manor, it seemed, upheld a certain standard, even if its mistress sounded distressed. The drive wound through a landscape of skeletal trees and fields, rimmed with white, past cottages with cheerful wreaths on their doors. Little Netherbury itself was a charming picture, a cluster of ancient stone buildings around a Norman church, its spire pointing a solemn finger to the pewter sky. But as Jenkins steered the car up a long, winding drive, past ancient oak trees, the atmosphere shifted. Finch Manor rose into view, a formidable Jacobean house, its dark brick facade imposing against the winter light. It was grand, certainly, but also possessed a certain austerity, a silence that seemed to absorb the sounds of the countryside rather than reflect them. Eleanor Finch, a wisp of a woman in a lavender dress, fluttered out to greet her as Jenkins opened the car door. Her face was etched with worry, and her hands, though clutching a delicate lace handkerchief, trembled noticeably. "Miss Marple, oh, you came! I'm so terribly relieved," she exclaimed, embracing Miss Marple with a surprising, albeit fleeting, strength. Her scent was faint, a mixture of lily of the valley and something indefinably frail. "My dear Eleanor, it's a pleasure to see you again," Miss Marple responded, returning the light embrace. She observed Eleanor closely, the darting eyes, the compressed lips, the barely concealed anxiety. Inside, the manor was surprisingly warm, though still retaining that peculiar quietude. A roaring fire blazed in the cavernous hall, illuminating dark oak paneling and ancestral portraits. And then Miss Marple's gaze fell upon it, the Christmas tree. It stood proudly in the center of the hall, towering almost to the ceiling, its dense fir branches laden with a shimmering array of antique glass baubles, strings of pearls, and tiny electric lights that pulsed with a soft, warm glow. It was without question the most magnificent Christmas tree Miss Marple had ever seen, a veritable monument to festive cheer. Yet even it seemed to possess a curious stillness, an almost watchful quality, as if aware of the unspoken tensions within the house. "It's splendid, isn't it?" Eleanor said, following her gaze, though her voice lacked genuine enthusiasm. "Alistair insists on the largest, grandest tree every year. He supervises its decoration himself. It's his one great passion, really, apart from his investments." At that moment a man emerged from a study adjacent to the hall. He was tall, thin, with a rather sharp aquiline nose and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. This, Miss Marple surmised, must be Alistair Finch. He had a stiff, formal air about him, and a watch chain gleamed importantly across his waistcoat. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, his voice clipped and precise. "Eleanor mentioned your arrival. Welcome to Finch Manor. I trust your journey was satisfactory." He offered a brief, cool hand, his grip surprisingly firm. There was no warmth in his greeting, merely a polite acknowledgment. "Perfectly satisfactory. Mr. Finch?" "A beautiful house you have here," Miss Marple replied, her eyes taking in the subtle lines of weariness around his own, the faint tremor in his hand that belied his outward composure. He seemed a man under considerable strain, or perhaps a man accustomed to keeping his emotions tightly reined. "Indeed. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some urgent correspondence to attend to before dinner. Eleanor, see that Miss Marple is settled." He nodded curtly and retreated, leaving behind a faint scent of cigar smoke and expensive cologne. Eleanor sighed, a sound like a deflating balloon. "He's always busy, always, especially lately." She led Miss Marple up a sweeping staircase. "Your room is the blue room. It has a lovely view of the winter garden. Our nephew Geoffrey will be arriving tomorrow just in time for Christmas Eve. He's Alistair's only living relative, you see, and quite eager." The word eager hung in the air, weighted with unspoken meaning. Miss Marple smiled faintly. She had met many eager nephews in her time. As she settled into the comfortable blue room, she glanced out at the frost-covered rose garden. Finch Manor, with its grand Christmas tree and its strained silences, was beginning to feel less like a peaceful holiday retreat and more like a stage being set for a very particular kind of drama. The air, as Eleanor had said, was indeed thick with anticipation, like the hush before a curtain rises. Chapter 3. An Untimely Demise. The next day, Christmas Eve, dawned with a deceptively gentle snowfall. Large feathery flakes drifted lazily past the blue room window, blanketing the garden in pristine white. Miss Marple, after a breakfast of perfectly prepared eggs and toast, spent the morning in the library, ostensibly perusing a volume of old botanical texts, but in reality observing the subtle undercurrents of the household. Eleanor was a bundle of frayed nerves, constantly rearranging the already perfect Christmas decorations and fussing over the dinner menu. Martha, the housekeeper, a woman with capable hands and an inscrutable expression, moved through the house with a quiet efficiency that seemed to absorb any excess tension. Alistair Finch, as expected, remained mostly closeted in his study, emerging only to issue terse instructions or to cast a critical eye over the Christmas tree, adjusting a bauble here, straightening a garland there, as if it were a sentinel guarding the house's secrets. In the afternoon, Geoffrey Finch arrived. He was a younger man, perhaps in his late 30s, with a rather too charming smile and eyes that seemed perpetually to be assessing. He greeted Eleanor with an effusive kiss, and Alistair with a hearty, if slightly forced, bonhomie. Miss Marple noticed Alistair's jaw tighten imperceptibly at Geoffrey's arrival, and Eleanor's nervous flutterings intensified. Geoffrey seemed particularly interested in the Christmas tree, circling it with an admiring gaze, though Miss Marple detected a flicker of something calculating in his eyes. "Magnificent, Uncle Alistair. Truly magnificent," Geoffrey boomed, clapping Alistair on the shoulder. Alistair merely grunted. As evening descended, the house became a tableau of strained festive cheer. A small, elegant dinner was served. Alistair unusually joined them, though his contributions to the conversation were mostly sardonic remarks about the state of the world. Eleanor tried valiantly to inject some warmth while Geoffrey regaled them with tales of his recent business ventures, which sounded, to Miss Marple's ear, rather less successful than he made them out to be. After dinner, as was apparently the Finch family tradition, they gathered in the great hall for the lighting of the Christmas tree's final candles, a few real candles interspersed among the electric lights for a touch of old-world charm. Alistair himself always performed this ritual. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows. The electric lights on the tree twinkled. The scent of pine and beeswax filled the air. Alistair, holding a long taper, began to light the candles, moving around the colossal tree with a solemn, almost proprietorial air. Eleanor watched him with a mixture of fear and devotion. Geoffrey stood slightly apart, a glass of brandy in his hand, a speculative look on his face. Miss Marple sat quietly in an armchair, observing the scene with her usual calm intensity. Suddenly, as Alistair reached the far side of the tree, near a particularly dense cluster of branches, he staggered. His taper clattered to the floor. A low, guttural sound escaped his lips. His hands, which had been reaching for a candle, clutched at his chest. Eleanor gasped a sharp, choked sound. "Alistair, are you all right?" But Alistair did not reply. His eyes, wide with a sudden, terrible recognition, stared past the shimmering baubles into the distant, unseeing space. He swayed for a moment, then pitched forward, collapsing silently at the very base of the magnificent Christmas tree, scattering a few delicate ornaments as he fell. The flickering candlelight cast his motionless form in an eerie, dramatic glow. Silence, stark and absolute, descended upon the hall. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the soft, almost festive hum of the electric Christmas lights. Eleanor let out a small, whimpering cry. Geoffrey, for once, seemed utterly speechless, his brandy glass slipping from his nerveless fingers to land with a muffled thud on the thick rug. Miss Marple, though her heart gave a jolt, remained outwardly composed. She was the first to move, walking purposefully towards the fallen man. Kneeling beside him, she gently felt for a pulse. There was none. Alistair Finch was undeniably tragically dead. Her gaze swept over the scene, the grand hall, the expectant faces, the silent, glittering Christmas tree that now stood as a silent witness to a sudden, devastating end. But her eyes lingered for a moment on the ground, near Alistair's head. Nestled among the fallen pine needles and shattered glass lay a single dark red poinsettia bloom, crushed beneath his weight, looking strangely out of place amidst the traditional Christmas decorations. This was no accident, Miss Marple knew, with a chilling certainty. The atmosphere Eleanor had spoken of had indeed broken, not with a thunderstorm, but with a fatal silent strike. The festive spirit of Finch Manor had been irrevocably shattered, leaving behind a chilling mystery at the foot of the resplendent Christmas tree. Chapter 4. Initial Scrutiny and Whispers. Chaos, a quiet, contained English chaos, ensued. Eleanor's initial whimpers gave way to soft, disbelieving sobs, and Geoffrey, recovering from his initial shock, began to pace frantically, running a hand through his slightly disheveled hair. Martha, the housekeeper, appeared from the shadows, her face a mask of controlled dismay, and immediately set about the grim task of telephoning the village doctor and the local constabulary. Miss Marple, after confirming Alistair's death, had withdrawn to an armchair by the fire, observing everything with her usual unobtrusive intensity. She noted the subtle differences in the reactions around her. Eleanor's grief, though genuine, seemed tinged with a peculiar relief, a strange lightness beneath the sorrow. Geoffrey's distress, while theatrical, struck Miss Marple as rather self-centered. He kept repeating, "Oh, Uncle Alistair, what a dreadful shock. On Christmas Eve of all nights." As if the timing were the greatest tragedy. Martha, meanwhile, simply got on with things, her hands busy, her eyes watchful. Soon Dr. Evans, the kindly, portly village physician, arrived, followed shortly by Inspector Dermot, a young, earnest man from the local police station, whose youth was somewhat belied by his serious demeanor. Dr. Evans, after a brief examination, confirmed the obvious. Alistair Finch is quite dead. Seems to be a sudden cardiac event, perhaps, A heart attack brought on by, well, by anything, really. Excitement, stress. He wasn't a young man. Inspector Dermott, however, was not quite so quick to accept the easy explanation. He was thorough, moving around the body, his gaze sweeping the hall. A heart attack, Doctor? On Christmas Eve, at the foot of his beloved Christmas tree? And he clutched his chest, you say, Miss Marple? Miss Marple nodded serenely. Indeed, Inspector. He made a most distressing sound, too. A sort of guttural gasp before he fell. Dermott knelt, examining the immediate vicinity of the body. He picked up the shattered fragments of a delicate glass bird ornament and carefully placed them in his handkerchief. His eyes scanned the pine needles, the crushed poinsettia bloom Miss Marple had noticed earlier, though he seemed not to attach any particular significance to it. He was lighting the candles, wasn't he? Dermott asked. Anyone near him? No, Inspector, Eleanor whispered, dabbing her eyes. He always insisted on doing it himself. He liked the ceremony. We were all over here by the fire. She gestured vaguely. I saw. And Mr. Geoffrey Finch? I was over there, Inspector, Geoffrey said, indicating a spot near the doorway. Enjoying a brandy. A dreadful shock it was. One moment he was fine, the next. He trailed off, shaking his head. Inspector Dermott proceeded with his preliminary questioning, making careful notes. Miss Marple offered her own observations only when directly asked, preferring to listen and watch. She noted the way Dermott's eyes kept flicking to the Christmas tree, as if it held some mute secret. Later, as the police surgeon was summoned and Alistair's body carefully removed, the house felt colder, emptier. The grand Christmas tree, still sparkling, now seemed to mock their grief with its unyielding festive cheer. Word, as it always does in a small village, spread with astonishing speed. By morning Christmas Day, the news of Alistair Finch's sudden death had reached every corner of Little Netherbury. The butcher, Mr. Hemlock, confided to his wife that he'd always found Mr. Finch a bit close-fisted, always haggling over the price of a ham. Mrs. Higgins, the postmistress, observed that Mr. Finch had received a surprising number of official-looking envelopes lately, more than usual for Christmas. Miss Marple, observing from her temporary perch at Finch Manor, noted these whispers, these fragments of village gossip, as she pieced together the background of Alistair Finch. He was, by all accounts, a man of considerable wealth, acquired through shrewd, if sometimes ruthless, business dealings. He was respected for his intellect, but not particularly liked for his personality. His relationship with his nephew, Geoffrey, was known to be strained, revolving mostly around the expectation of inheritance. And Eleanor, his wife, was generally seen as a long-suffering spouse, perpetually overshadowed by her formidable husband. As the morning wore on, Inspector Dermott returned, his expression more grave. "Miss Marple," he said, finding her sipping tea by the now subdued fire in the hall, "the preliminary report from the police surgeon is in. It seems Mr. Finch did indeed suffer a heart attack. However, there's a small detail. A faint, almost imperceptible rash on his left wrist. The surgeon believes it might be an allergic reaction, but to what, we don't know." Miss Marple lowered her teacup slowly. "An allergic reaction, Inspector? How very curious. Perhaps he touched something near the tree." Her gaze drifted to the crushed poinsettia bloom still lying near where Alistair had fallen, now a dark stain against the pristine pine needles. She remembered her own careful studies of poisonous plants. She knew that some common plants, if handled carelessly, could indeed cause irritation. But could one cause a fatal heart attack? It seemed an unlikely leap. Yet the inspector's mention of a rash immediately brought the poinsettia to her mind. Alistair Finch's death, initially deemed a tragic natural occurrence, was beginning to acquire the faint, unsettling scent of something more sinister. The seemingly ordinary event of a man collapsing on Christmas Eve was slowly but surely transforming into a murder inquiry, with the silent, glittering Christmas tree standing as the central, enigmatic piece of evidence. And Miss Marple felt a familiar prickle of intrigue. The game, it seemed, was truly afoot. Chapter 5. The Peculiar Poinsettia. The following day, Boxing Day, the festive veneer of Finch Manor had all but crumbled, replaced by an atmosphere of hushed suspicion. Inspector Dermott, now convinced there was more to Alistair Finch's death than a simple heart attack, had cordoned off the hall. The magnificent Christmas tree, once a symbol of joy, now stood as an imposing silent witness, almost under guard. Miss Marple, always resourceful, had managed to secure a few moments alone with the scene before the official police photographer arrived. She approached the tree, her gaze meticulous. The crushed poinsettia bloom still lay where Alistair had fallen. She knelt, her gloved hand carefully brushing away pine needles. The petals were a rich, dark red, almost burgundy, and the stem, though broken, still exuded a faint milky sap. She remembered her own garden in St. Mary Mead, and the small, rather temperamental poinsettia she had once tried to cultivate. She knew that the sap of the Euphorbia pulcherrima, while generally only mildly irritating, could cause contact dermatitis, but it was far from lethal. Yet the doctor's mention of a rash lingered in her mind. Miss Marple examined the tree's lower branches, looking for any other anomalies. The ornaments were exquisite, a collection of antique glass and delicate filigree, each seemingly placed with Alistair's exacting precision. She noticed a faint discoloration on one of the lower branches, near where the poinsettia had fallen, almost as if something had been wiped away. She gently touched the spot, but could discern nothing specific. Later, Inspector Dermot, looking rather perplexed, sought Miss Marple out in the drawing-room. "We've had a look at the poinsettia, Miss Marple. Dr. Evans confirms the sap can cause skin irritation, but he's adamant it couldn't cause a fatal heart attack. The autopsy results are still pending, but there was no obvious internal injury or acute poisoning." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed, Inspector. The poinsettia itself is unlikely to be the direct cause. However, its presence and the rash suggest a contact. Could it be that Mr. Finch perhaps touched something else and then accidentally brushed against the poinsettia, transferring something?" Dermot frowned, stroking his chin. "It's possible. But what would he have touched? We found nothing unusual on the tree itself, apart from the ornaments. No strange residue, no foreign substances. Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "the significance lies not in the poinsettia itself, but in what it concealed or indicated. Sometimes, Inspector, the most obvious clue is the one we overlook because it seems too innocuous, like a small, brightly colored detail that distracts from the larger picture." Dermot looked at her, a glimmer of respect in his eyes. He had initially found Miss Marple's presence an unnecessary complication, but her quiet observations were proving unexpectedly astute. "You think the poinsettia was placed there intentionally?" "I merely consider the possibility, Inspector," Miss Marple replied. "À moi de ceci persiste." Mr. Finch was a man of meticulous habits, was he not? It seems curious for a poinsettia, a plant typically placed in pots, to be lying crushed at the foot of his carefully decorated tree, precisely where he fell. "Martha," Dermot mused, "the housekeeper," said Mrs. Finch, "bought several poinsettias for decoration around the house. It's possible one fell, or was knocked over." "Possible, certainly," Miss Marple conceded. But Mr. Finch was lighting candles, concentrating on his task. For a plant to simply fall and be crushed precisely under his body seems a little too convenient for an accident. Just then Martha appeared, bearing a tray of fresh tea. As she poured, Miss Marple caught her eye. Martha's gaze, usually so impassive, held a fleeting flicker of something. Fear? Resignation? "Martha," Miss Marple ventured softly, "do you recall where the poinsettias were usually kept before they were arranged? Perhaps near the Christmas tree or in a specific corner?" Martha paused, her hand hovering over a teacup. "Well, Mrs. Finch had them in pots by the window in the drawing-room for a few days. Then, the day before yesterday, she brought them into the hall, ready for arrangement, as she does every year. She liked to have them fresh." "And was one ever placed on the Christmas tree itself?" Miss Marple asked, her voice light, almost conversational. Martha frowned, considering. "On the tree? No, miss, never. Mr. Alistair would never allow it. He had his own specific decorations. Poinsettias were always in pots, or in vases on the mantelpiece." This was precisely the confirmation Miss Marple had been looking for. The poinsettia at the base of the tree was an anomaly. It wasn't just a dropped decoration. It was something else entirely. "Thank you, Martha." "That's very helpful," Miss Marple said, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. She looked at Inspector Dermot. You see, Inspector, a peculiar detail indeed. The poinsettia, by its very presence at the foot of the tree, now begs a crucial question. How did it get there, and what was its true purpose? Dermot's brow furrowed in thought. The seemingly insignificant poinsettia, dismissed as a mere accident, was now being positioned by Miss Marple as a potential key. It was a classic misdirection, a common village trick to focus on the obvious while the real clue lay subtly hidden. The Christmas tree itself, or rather, the area around its base, was beginning to look less like a festive tableau and more like a carefully constructed scene. Chapter 6, Unraveling Motives. The days following Christmas blurred into a somber continuation of the investigation. Inspector Dermot, now thoroughly engaged by Miss Marple's quiet insights, had begun to dig deeper into Alistair Finch's life. The preliminary autopsy report, while confirming a heart attack, also noted a peculiar sensitivity in the skin, corroborating the rash, but offered no conclusive evidence of direct poisoning that would explain a sudden death. It seemed they were dealing with a more subtle form of lethality. Miss Marple, meanwhile, continued her own observations, often while knitting by the drawing-room fire, her needles clicking a rhythmic counterpoint to the quiet tension of the house. She noticed Eleanor's almost frantic attempts to keep up appearances, despite her evident grief. Her tears often seemed to flow more easily when Geoffrey was present, and Miss Marple wondered if they were tears for Alistair or for her own precarious position. Geoffrey, on the other hand, was less subtle. He paced, he worried aloud about Uncle Alistair's affairs, and he made repeated, thinly veiled inquiries about the will. "It's just that Uncle Alistair was a very private man," Geoffrey explained to Miss Marple one afternoon, as she painstakingly unraveled a misplaced stitch. "He never really discussed his financial arrangements. And with the way he'd been acting lately, making all sorts of changes, apparently. One worries, you see, that everything is in order." He sighed dramatically. "After all, I am his only surviving blood relative. It would be quite a burden, but I feel a duty to ensure his legacy is respected." Miss Marple merely hummed, her eyes fixed on her knitting. "A heavy burden indeed, Mr. Geoffrey. One hopes it would be one you could manage." Geoffrey missed the subtle irony. "Precisely. And Alistair and I, well, we had our disagreements, of course. All families do. He was a difficult man, very set in his ways. But I always had his best interests at heart. I merely wanted him to see reason about certain investments." He looked at her expectantly, but Miss Marple offered no further comment. Later, Miss Marple had a quiet conversation with Eleanor. "My dear, forgive my intrusion, but Geoffrey seems rather concerned about Alistair's will. Did your husband make any recent changes?" Eleanor wrung her hands. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's all so dreadful." "Yes, he did. Just last month. He called in his solicitor. He was always doing it, changing this, altering that. He enjoyed the power, I think. But this time he was particularly secretive. He said he was disinheriting the undeserving and rewarding true loyalty. He wouldn't say more, but he and Geoffrey had a terrible row after that." "A terrible row?" Miss Marple prompted softly. "Yes, shouting, you see. Geoffrey was furious. He felt Alistair was being unfair. Alistair, for his part, accused Geoffrey of being a spendthrift and a parasite. It was most unpleasant." Eleanor shivered. "I sometimes think Alistair enjoyed making people uncomfortable. He was very fond of his little games, as he called them." Miss Marple filed this away. Alistair Finch, a man who played games with his family, particularly with his will, and who had recently disinherited someone while rewarding true loyalty. This opened up a wider field of suspects than just Geoffrey, who, apart from Eleanor, might have been considered loyal by Alistair, and who, besides Geoffrey, might have been deemed undeserving. Inspector Dermot's investigations into Alistair's business dealings confirmed that the deceased had indeed been making significant changes. He had sold off a substantial portion of his shares in a promising new venture, much to Geoffrey's vocal disapproval, and had transferred a large sum of money to a new, undisclosed account just weeks before his death. "It's all very convoluted, Miss Marple," Dermot confessed, running a hand through his hair. "Geoffrey stands to inherit a tidy sum if the old will is upheld, or if Alistair died intestate. But if this new secret will exists, then his fortune might be significantly reduced, or even diverted entirely. And if it were diverted, Inspector, to whom might it have gone? Miss Marple asked. Was there anyone else Alistair Finch might have considered loyal? Dermot consulted his notes. His solicitor wouldn't confirm the details of the new will, citing client confidentiality. But he did mention that Mr. Finch had recently expressed a strong interest in a charitable foundation dedicated to botanical research. Apparently he was quite passionate about certain exotic plants. Botanical research? Miss Marple's mind immediately returned to the peculiar poinsettia at the foot of the tree and the faint milky sap she had observed. Could there be a connection? Alistair Finch, a man obsessed with his Christmas tree, with botanical research, and with playing games with his will. The motive was beginning to solidify. A change of will, a disinherited nephew, and a potential beneficiary in the form of a botanical charity. It seemed Alistair Finch's death was intricately linked to his posthumous legacy. The game he played with his family had perhaps been turned fatally against him. The question now was not just why he died, but how. This subtle, undetectable death had been administered, and by whose hand? The answer, Miss Marple suspected, lay hidden in plain sight, perhaps even within the very objects Alistair cherished. Chapter 7. A Maid's Tale. The bleak winter days continued, each one bringing Miss Marple closer to a disturbing picture of Finch Manor and its inhabitants. The servants, particularly Martha, the housekeeper, were a constant, quiet presence. Miss Marple had always found that servants, with their access to the rhythms and secrets of a household, often possessed a wealth of untapped information. One afternoon, as Miss Marple sat in the kitchen, ostensibly admiring Martha's perfectly crimped pastry crusts, she gently steered the conversation towards Alistair Finch's habits. Martha, usually reserved, seemed more amenable to talk when engaged in her domestic duties. Mr. Finch was a creature of habit, wasn't he, Martha? Miss Marple began, her voice soft and unassuming. Especially around the Christmas tree. Mrs. Finch mentioned he supervised its decoration himself. Martha nodded, her hands kneading dough with practiced ease. Oh, yes, Miss Marple, every year. He wouldn't let anyone else touch it until it was just so. He loved that tree, he did. Spent hours on it, arranging every bauble, checking every light, right up until the very last moment. And the poinsettias? Miss Marple asked casually. You mentioned Mrs. Finch had them in the drawing-room before they were brought into the hall. Did Mr. Finch have any particular aversion to them? Martha paused, wiping her hands on her apron. Aversion? No, not exactly. But he was particular about where they went. He said they were too common for the tree itself, always in pots, on the side tables. He did, however, have a fascination with certain unusual plants. He had a small locked greenhouse out back where he kept his more exotic specimens. Said they needed special care. Miss Marple's antennae quivered. A locked greenhouse, you say? How intriguing. Did anyone else ever tend to these plants? No, miss, only Mr. Alistair, and sometimes a gentleman who visited him, a Mr. Quentin. He was a botanist, I believe. Came up from London a few times, always went straight to the greenhouse with Mr. Finch. Martha's voice lowered slightly, as if sharing a confidence. Always seemed a bit shifty, that Mr. Quentin, and Mr. Alistair would get all excited after his visits, more secretive than usual. This was a new, crucial piece of information. A botanist visitor, a locked greenhouse, and Alistair's excitement. It aligned perfectly with Dermot's discovery of Alistair's interest in a botanical charity. When was Mr. Quentin's last visit, Martha? Miss Marple inquired, her knitting needles clicking with a feigned casualness. Martha thought for a moment. Oh, let me see. Just a few days before Christmas Eve, I think. He came in the morning and left late in the afternoon. Said he was going back to London. Didn't stay the night. She looked at Miss Marple, a hint of something resembling curiosity in her eyes. He was a strange one, Mr. Quentin, always carrying a small leather satchel, very carefully. Did you ever see what was in the satchel? Miss Marple asked, her voice calm. Martha shook her head. No, miss, never. But one time I was clearing up in the hall after he'd gone, and I found a small, empty glass vial tucked underneath a chair. No label, just clear glass. I thought it odd, so I put it in the waste bin. An empty glass vial. A botanist visitor. A locked greenhouse. Miss Marple felt a thrilling sense of a pattern emerging, like one of her intricate lace doilies. "Martha, you are most observant," Miss Marple praised, a genuine warmth in her voice. "Did you notice anything else unusual about Mr. Allister around the time of Mr. Quentin's visit? Perhaps he seemed more agitated, or perhaps he received any unusual packages?" Martha hesitated. "Well, there was a small parcel wrapped in plain brown paper delivered by special courier the day after Mr. Quentin left. Mr. Allister collected it himself from the delivery man, which he rarely did, and he carried it straight to his study, looking very pleased with himself. He spent the entire afternoon in there and told me explicitly not to disturb him. Said it was delicate research materials." "Delicate research materials," Miss Marple repeated, a thoughtful expression on her face. "And this was the day before Christmas Eve, the day before he died?" "That's right, miss. Then, of course, the next evening—" "Well, you know what happened." Martha's voice trailed off, a note of genuine sadness replacing her usual stoicism. Miss Marple thanked Martha warmly, her mind buzzing. The timeline was becoming disturbingly clear. Mr. Quentin, the botanist, visits. A mysterious package arrives. Allister Finch isolates himself for delicate research. And then, on Christmas Eve, he collapses at the foot of his beloved, meticulously decorated Christmas tree, a crushed poinsettia lying beneath him, and a faint rash on his wrist. The delicate research materials, could they be connected to the empty vial Martha had found? And if so, were these materials truly for botanical research or for something far more sinister? It seemed Allister Finch's fatal end was not merely a result of family squabbles over a will, but perhaps a direct consequence of his own scientific curiosity, or a dangerous experiment gone awry, or worse, a weapon wielded by a cunning hand. The Christmas tree, Miss Marple now suspected, was not just a symbol, but perhaps even an instrument. Chapter 8. The Case of the Missing Gift. The mention of the delicate research materials and the empty glass vial sent Miss Marple's thoughts down a new, chilling path. She had read enough about toxicology in her crime novels to know that certain plant-derived substances could be incredibly potent and tragically difficult to detect. She also knew that a rash could be a symptom of a highly localized contact with such a substance. Inspector Dermott, alerted to Martha's revelations, dispatched officers to search Allister Finch's locked greenhouse and his study. They found various botanical specimens, rare and exotic, but nothing immediately suspicious. The small plain brown wrapping paper, however, was found meticulously flattened in a waste bin in the study. It bore a return address from a specialist botanical supplier in London known for obscure and potent plant extracts. "They supply all sorts of things, Miss Marple," Dermott reported, looking grim. "Everything from rare seeds to highly concentrated essential oils for medicinal use. And some, they warn, are for professional handling only." He hesitated. "There was also a copy of Allister Finch's will dated 2 months ago. It leaves almost everything to a newly established Allister Finch Botanical Research Foundation. Geoffrey inherits a rather paltry annuity, and Mrs. Finch, while provided for, does not receive the bulk of the estate." The motive for Geoffrey was now crystal clear. Disinheritance. For Eleanor, a comfortable but diminished future. But what about Allister's delicate research? Was he dabbling in something dangerous? Miss Marple's attention, however, was drawn to another detail, mentioned by Eleanor during one of her tearful recollections. Allister was so particular about gifts, she'd sighed. He expected only the most thoughtful and specific presents. He had given me a list, you see, of things he truly desired. And for me, he always asked for a certain rare botanical etching. "And did you procure this etching for him, my dear?" Miss Marple had asked gently. Eleanor had sniffed. "Oh, yes. I commissioned it from a very exclusive dealer in London months ago. It was to be a surprise, a rare engraving of a particular South American orchid he admired. It arrived last week, beautifully wrapped. I placed it under the Christmas tree for him, as I always do with his special gift. But it wasn't there on Christmas morning. The police were searching, and I was so distraught I forgot to mention it, but I distinctly remember placing it. It was gone. Gone? Miss Marple repeated. And it was under the Christmas tree? Yes, right at the back near the base, tucked behind a garland. He always liked to find his most precious gift there. But it simply vanished. Perhaps it was misplaced during the upheaval. Eleanor had seemed too overwhelmed by grief to dwell on a missing Christmas present. Miss Marple, however, found this most peculiar. A specially commissioned, expensive gift, placed carefully under the tree, vanishes on the night Alistair Finch dies. It was not merely misplaced. She discussed this with Inspector Dermott. "Inspector, Mrs. Finch mentioned a missing Christmas gift, a valuable botanical etching. She placed it under the tree, near where Mr. Finch fell, but it was not there on Christmas morning. Could it be relevant?" Dermott looked surprised. A missing gift? No one mentioned this. We found the usual assortment of unopened presents, but no sign of an expensive etching. He immediately dispatched officers to question Eleanor further and conduct a more thorough search of the hall and adjacent rooms. The search, however, yielded nothing. The etching was indeed gone. "This is most curious, Miss Marple," Dermott admitted, returning later that evening. "Why would someone steal a gift during the commotion of a death? Unless it was stolen before his death, or was connected to his death somehow." "Precisely, Inspector," Miss Marple said, a glint in her eye. "Consider the sequence. Mr. Finch collapses at the foot of the tree, near where this gift was placed. He was lighting candles, concentrating. No one was close to him. Yet a valuable item from that very spot disappears. Could it be, Inspector, that the missing gift was not merely a theft, but perhaps a container, or held something that was a container?" Dermott's eyes widened slightly. "You mean a poison hidden in the gift, and then administered by Mr. Finch himself, accidentally, when he reached for it?" "It is a possibility," Miss Marple allowed. "He was particular about his Christmas rituals, and no doubt eager to discover his special gift." The rush of blood to the head, the sudden bending down, combined with a potent irritant or toxin, could indeed trigger a cardiac event in a man of his age and constitution. And if the gift itself was the means, then the perpetrator would naturally remove it to conceal the evidence. The theory was startling in its simplicity and chilling in its implication. Alistair Finch had not been murdered by a direct act of violence, but perhaps by a cunningly planted self-inflicted contact with a toxic substance concealed within his own Christmas tradition. And the missing gift, Miss Marple suspected, was not just a present, but the murder weapon itself. The puzzle pieces, though still scattered, were beginning to align with a terrifying logic. Chapter 9, Poisons and Potions. The idea of the missing gift as a vessel for poison, and Alistair Finch as an unwitting agent of his own demise, sent a fresh wave of urgency through Inspector Dermott's investigation. He immediately turned his attention back to the specialist botanical supplier in London and the mysterious Mr. Quentin. "We're checking all the records from that supplier." "Miss Marple," Dermott informed her, looking rather harried. "It's a small, very niche company. If someone ordered a particularly potent extract, they'll have a record." Miss Marple nodded. "And Mr. Quentin, the botanist who visited Mr. Finch? Has he been located?" "We've tracked him down," Dermott replied. "He's a respected researcher at a London university. He admits to visiting Alistair Finch, says he was collaborating on a research project. Alistair was funding his work on a rare, highly toxic South American plant, a species that produces a powerful, fast-acting neurotoxin when its sap is ingested or gets into the bloodstream via an open wound." Dermott paused, his voice dropping. "He insists he only brought dried samples, carefully sealed. He emphatically denies anything to do with Finch's death. Said he left Finch with some instructions on handling the samples, emphasizing extreme caution, a highly toxic South American plant, a fast-acting neurotoxin, instructions on handling." This was more concrete than a simple poinsettia rash. "Did Mr. Quentin mention anything about the gift, Inspector?" Miss Marple asked, her eyes keen. "No, nothing. He seemed genuinely shocked about the missing etching. He did, however, recall seeing a small, beautifully carved wooden box under the tree during his last visit. He thought it was a decorative item. He said Alistair seemed quite possessive of it and mentioned it contained something special for Christmas Eve." A small, beautifully carved wooden box. not an etching. Eleanor had described an etching, beautifully wrapped. Was Eleanor mistaken, or was something else afoot? Miss Marple's mind, however, was already making connections. A wooden box, Inspector, and a neurotoxin, and Mr. Finch's delicate research materials. Could it be that the missing gift was not the etching itself, but rather this wooden box containing the toxin, and that the etching was merely a decoy or a misunderstanding on Eleanor's part? It's possible, Dermot conceded. But how would it have been administered, and why would Alistair expose himself to it? Perhaps not intentionally, Inspector, Miss Marple mused. Consider, Alistair Finch was precise, meticulous. He loved ceremony. He was also, by Martha's account, very pleased with himself after receiving that mysterious parcel. If he believed he was handling delicate research materials, he might be less careful than if he knew it was a poison. And if the substance was a neurotoxin, as you say, a tiny amount, getting into a small cut or abrasion, could be lethal. She recalled the faint rash on Alistair's wrist. Could it have been an abrasion or a point of contact rather than a general rash? We did find some microabrasions on his left wrist, Dermot admitted, checking his notes. The surgeon thought they were incidental, perhaps from brushing against something, or from unwrapping a carefully concealed container within his special Christmas gift. Miss Marple suggested a container that might have leaked or had a residue. She thought of the crushed poinsettia again. If the toxin was colorless and scentless, perhaps it was put on the poinsettia leaves deliberately to appear as a natural rash, but the real point of contact was the container. But who would do this, Miss Marple? Dermot asked, frustration clear in his voice. Geoffrey? He has motive, but how would he get hold of such a specific poison and know how to use it so subtly? The person who knew Mr. Finch's habits, his passions, his vulnerabilities, and had access to his inner sanctum, Inspector, Miss Marple replied. The person who knew about his delicate research, who knew about his special Christmas gift ritual, and who perhaps resented his games more than anyone suspected. The person who could plant the real gift and remove it without being seen. Dermot looked around the hall, his gaze falling upon Eleanor, who was nervously arranging some mistletoe, and then Martha, who was polishing a silver tray with an almost fierce intensity. Geoffrey, meanwhile, was out, ostensibly making funeral arrangements. And the missing gift, the wooden box? Dermot asked. If it contained the poison, where is it now? A careful murderer, Inspector, would ensure its complete disappearance, Miss Marple said. Disposed of, perhaps, in a way that left no trace. Incinerated, perhaps? Or hidden somewhere inaccessible. She thought of the manor's expansive grounds, its outbuildings, its old well. The possibilities were endless. The mystery was no longer a matter of a simple heart attack or a common poison. It was a sophisticated, insidious plot, relying on a meticulous understanding of the victim's routine and a unique botanical weapon. The murderer was someone with not just motive, but also means, knowledge, and a chillingly steady hand. The Christmas tree, Miss Marple now understood, was more than just a setting. It was the very centerpiece of a carefully orchestrated death, designed to look like a tragic accident. Chapter 10, The Garden Secret. Armed with the knowledge of a highly toxic South American plant and microabrasions, Inspector Dermot returned to the greenhouse. He found no obvious containers or evidence of the neurotoxin, but the greenhouse itself contained a meticulously labeled collection of rare and exotic plants. Amongst them was a species of strychnos vine, known to yield strychnine, and a Ricinus communis plant, the source of reichin. But none matched the specific South American neurotoxin Mr. Quentin had mentioned collaborating on. It seemed Alistair had a dangerous hobby, but the murder weapon was still elusive. Miss Marple, meanwhile, took a stroll in the winter garden, a keen eye for details guiding her. The ground was still covered in a thin, glistening layer of frost, but the air was milder. She passed dormant rose bushes, evergreen shrubs, and the skeletal remains of summer's herbaceous borders. Her thoughts were on the various plants that could cause a rash, and more dangerously, death. She recalled the crushed poinsettia, While innocuous in its common form, she remembered a local village tale about a particularly sensitive woman who had developed a severe reaction to handling the plant's sap, far beyond simple irritation. But that was an isolated incident. The neurotoxin theory was far more compelling. Her path led her past a small, unassuming shed nestled at the edge of the formal gardens, partially obscured by a dense clump of winter jasmine. It was a humble structure, seemingly used for gardening tools, but Miss Marple's intuition told her to pay it closer attention. A wisp of smoke, almost imperceptible, against the gray sky curled from a small chimney on its roof. It was the only sign of combustion she had seen in the outbuildings. She remembered Dermot's comment about a careful murderer ensuring the complete disappearance of the poison-laced gift, perhaps by incineration. She cautiously approached the shed. The door was unlocked, a simple latch holding it in place. Inside it was warm, with a small, recently stoked brazier glowing in one corner, clearly used for burning garden waste. The air hung with the faint acrid scent of burnt wood and something else, something subtly metallic and chemical. Her eyes scanned the shelves, filled with gardening implements, sacks of soil, and pots. On a small workbench, amidst a scattering of wood shavings, she noticed a faint, almost invisible residue. It was a fine silvery powder clinging to the rough wood. It caught the weak winter light, glinting subtly. Miss Marple's mind, drawing on countless observations of human behavior and village life, made a swift and alarming connection. She remembered a tale from her youth of a local poacher who would use a particular method to catch small game, leaving a seemingly natural death. He would apply a highly irritating, almost invisible substance to bait, which, when ingested, caused a rapid and fatal seizure. The local doctor would often put it down to heart failure, having no knowledge of the specific obscure plant used, the silvery residue, the neurotoxin, the microabrasions, the sudden heart attack. It was all beginning to fit into a terrifyingly elegant and cruel scheme. Just then, she heard footsteps crunching on the gravel path outside. It was Martha, the housekeeper, carrying a small, wrapped parcel. She stopped short, seeing Miss Marple in the shed doorway. "Miss Marple, I was just bringing some old newspapers to burn. The brazier's still warm, you see." Martha's voice was strained, her usual composure fractured. Her eyes darted towards the workbench, then to the brazier, then back to Miss Marple, a flicker of raw fear in their depths. Miss Marple looked at the newspaper parcel in Martha's hand, then at the silvery residue, then at the faint wisp of smoke from the chimney. "Indeed, Martha. It seems you've been rather busy out here, haven't you? Keeping the fire going, disposing of things." Martha swallowed hard, her knuckles white as she gripped the parcel. Her face, usually so impassive, now betrayed a profound anxiety. "Just clearing up, Miss Marple. There's so much to do after all this." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle, but with an underlying steel. "But tell me, Martha, have you by any chance seen a small, beautifully carved wooden box? The one Mr. Finch was said to be so fond of, which held his special Christmas gift?" Martha's eyes widened, a flicker of panic. She took an involuntary step back, clutching the parcel tighter. Her gaze darted from the brazier to the residue, then to Miss Marple's steady, knowing eyes. Miss Marple simply waited, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. The faint, acrid scent in the shed, combined with Martha's sudden palpable fear, spoke volumes. The garden's secret, it seemed, was not one of cultivation, but of disposal. And Miss Marple had a sudden, terrible insight into the true perpetrator and the meticulously planned silent death that had claimed Alistair Finch. Chapter 11. The Gathering of Suspects. The discovery in the garden shed, coupled with Martha's palpable fear, galvanized Miss Marple. She returned to the main house, her mind rapidly piecing together the final chilling elements of the puzzle. She sought out Inspector Dermot, her expression calm but firm. "Inspector," she began, "I believe we have sufficient information to gather everyone involved. The pieces, I suspect, are now all in place." Dermot, though surprised by her sudden certainty, had learned to trust her instincts. He arranged for Eleanor, Geoffrey, and Martha to assemble in the drawing-room. The atmosphere was brittle, charged with unspoken accusations and simmering fear. Eleanor sat on the edge of a sofa, wringing her hands, while Geoffrey stood by the fireplace, radiating an impatient nervousness. Martha, typically composed, looked pale and avoided all eye contact, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Miss Marple sat opposite them, her knitting needles now absent, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Inspector Dermott stood quietly by her side, a silent, watchful presence. "We are here," Miss Marple began, her voice clear and gentle, "to discuss the unfortunate death of Mr. Alistair Finch. Initially, it appeared to be a natural passing, a heart attack. But certain details, as Inspector Dermott can attest, have led us to believe otherwise." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. Eleanor let out a soft whimper. Geoffrey shifted uncomfortably. Martha remained stone-faced. "We know, for instance," Miss Marple continued, "that Mr. Finch was conducting delicate research into certain botanical substances. We know he received a package containing such materials shortly before his death, and we know that he had a peculiar Christmas Eve ritual involving a special gift placed at the foot of his magnificent Christmas tree." Her gaze drifted slowly from Eleanor to Geoffrey, then to Martha. "We also know that this special gift, a beautifully carved wooden box, not an etching, as Mrs. Finch mistakenly believed, vanished on the night of Mr. Finch's death. And that, Inspector Dermott and I now believe, is because it contained the very means of his demise." Geoffrey scoffed. "Want they to be? A gift? Poison? That's preposterous. Uncle Alistair was always so careful." "Indeed, Mr. Geoffrey, he was careful. But he was also, by all accounts, a man who enjoyed his games, a man who was, perhaps, too proud of his own intellect, too confident in his handling of dangerous things." Miss Marple's eyes now fixed on Martha. "He was, according to Martha, in possession of a highly toxic South American plant extract, delivered in that mysterious package." Martha flinched, her breath catching in her throat. "This extract," Miss Marple explained, addressing the room, "was not meant for ingestion, but could be lethal upon contact with a small abrasion, causing a rapid neurotoxic reaction that would mimic a heart attack. And there were micro-abrasions on Mr. Finch's wrist." Eleanor gasped, her eyes wide with dawning horror. "The missing wooden box," Miss Marple pressed on, "we believe, contained this substance. It was deliberately coated on the inside rim, or perhaps on a small concealed applicator within the box, designed to be touched when opening it. Mr. Finch, reaching for his special gift, perhaps excited, perhaps slightly careless, would have made contact. The rush of blood, the excitement, would have accelerated the effect." She looked directly at Martha. "And the crushing of the poinsettia, Martha, at the foot of the tree, that was a deliberate misdirection, wasn't it? To suggest a simple allergic reaction, to conceal the true potent cause of death. You even tried to dispose of the last remaining evidence in the garden shed, didn't you, just this morning, after the brazier had cooled?" Martha's face was now a mask of pure terror. She tried to speak, but only a choked sound emerged. "You knew about Alistair's dangerous experiments, didn't you, Martha?" Miss Marple's voice was still gentle, but inexorable. "You overheard Mr. Quentin's warnings. You saw the delicate research materials. And you had the opportunity, the knowledge of his rituals, and the deep, silent resentment against a man who, by all accounts, was not always kind or fair." Geoffrey stared at Martha, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. Eleanor merely whimpered, covering her mouth with her hand. "Alistair Finch made changes to his will, disinheriting those he deemed undeserving and rewarding loyalty," Miss Marple continued, her gaze unwavering from Martha. "But Alistair Finch had a peculiar definition of loyalty. Perhaps he was always playing games, but someone grew tired of his games. Someone decided to end them quite permanently with a deadly touch of botanical ingenuity. And you, Martha, were in the perfect position to know everything, to see everything, and to act." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire. All eyes were on Martha, whose carefully constructed facade had finally shattered, revealing the desperate, frightened woman beneath. The revelation hung in the air, a chilling testament to the quiet, hidden motives that could fester, unseen, within the most unassuming of individuals. The truth finally was out in the open. Chapter 12, The Truth Revealed. Martha, her face ashen, finally broke. A low, guttural sob escaped her, and she collapsed into a nearby chair, burying her face in her hands. Inspector Dermott moved swiftly, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Martha," he said, his voice firm but not unkind, "Miss Marple's observations are compelling. We found the faint residue in the shed. The evidence is mounting. You must tell us the truth." Slowly, haltingly, Martha began to speak, her voice barely a whisper, thick with tears and years of suppressed resentment. He was a cruel man, Inspector, and Miss Marple is right. He played his games. He took pleasure in it. For 30 years I served him and Mrs. Finch. 30 years of his slights, his constant criticisms, his promises that never came to anything. Eleanor looked up, her own face now etched with a deeper understanding, a mix of pity and fear. "He promised me," Martha continued, her voice gaining a bitter edge, "that he would provide for me in his will. Said I was the only truly loyal one, unlike that good-for-nothing nephew. But then I overheard him talking to his solicitor just a week before Christmas. He was leaving everything to that botanical foundation. He called me just a servant, a necessary convenience. Said my loyalty was merely my duty and deserved no special reward." Miss Marple nodded. "Alistair Finch enjoyed his power. He enjoyed manipulating people with the promise of inheritance, dangling it just out of reach." "I saw the parcel arrive," Martha confessed, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Champiot, I heard Mr. Quentin's warnings to Mr. Finch about handling the plant extracts. I knew about his Christmas ritual, the special gift under the tree. He used to talk about it for weeks, the anticipation. He'd even show me the wooden box he'd chosen that year, asking me to polish it. He loved that particular box, a gift from his travels." "So you took the box?" Dermott prompted gently. "Yes, that morning Christmas Eve, when everyone was busy. I took it, and I opened the parcel he'd received. The delicate research materials. It was a small vial, marked with a skull and crossbones, and a tiny brush. Mr. Quentin's notes were with it, describing its effects, how it entered the system through a tiny cut, how it caused a rapid cardiac arrest that mimicked a natural death." Martha shuddered. "He called it devil's breath. I knew then. I knew what I had to do." "You coated the inside of the box, didn't you, Martha?" Miss Marple asked, her voice quiet. "Yes, with the brush. Just a thin layer around the rim where he would naturally put his fingers when he opened it. And I put it back under the tree, where he always placed his favorite gift. I placed a poinsettia bloom on top of it, so if anyone looked closely, they might think any skin irritation was from that, not the real poison." Martha's shoulders shook with fresh sobs. "He loved his games. I played one last game with him. The cruel ingenuity of it was chilling. The Christmas tree, meant to symbolize life and renewal, had become the silent accomplice to a meticulously planned act of revenge. The death of the Christmas tree was not just the physical death at its base, but the extinguishing of the very spirit of generosity and trust that the season embodied, replaced by the bitter fruit of resentment." Martha was led away, her sobs echoing in the now silent hall. Eleanor, pale and shaken, could only murmur, I never knew she harbored such resentment." Geoffrey, for once, was speechless, the reality of his uncle's death far more sordid than any financial disappointment. Miss Marple watched them all, a faint sadness in her eyes. Human nature, she reflected, was a complicated tapestry, woven with threads of kindness and cruelty, love and hate, loyalty and resentment. Even in the seemingly peaceful village, beneath the festive lights and the quiet hum of routine, the most potent poisons often lay hidden, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. Alistair Finch had paid the ultimate price for his games, and Martha for her years of silent suffering. The grand Christmas tree, once a symbol of joy